The topic that I want to talk is about ecosystem services in, I pick grasslands, but it could be your particular system too. And what I would like to convince is that of a shift in a paradigm. And so from the paradigm that I'm trying to sell you here is the shift from ecosystem services supply to ecosystem service demand. So this is sort of a brief introduction on ecosystem services, and the idea is that there are 4 groups of ecosystem services, what they call the supporting ecosystem services, the provisioning ecosystem services, the regulating ecosystem services, and cultural ecosystem services. Is this a concept that is new for some of you? You want me to go deeper in this? Yes. And so you have 2, if you are bored, you just roll your eyes. And if you have questions because I'm going too fast, you just raise your hand. So those are my 2 cues. If you start falling asleep. So ecosystem services, the idea is are the goods and services that benefits people from ecosystems. So this is sort of an anthropocentric view of the ecosystems. What is that ecosystems give humans? And so on the one hand, the easiest ecosystem services to understand are what we call the provisioning ecosystem services. So the ecosystems provide fish, wood, but also provide clean water, because through a watershed, the microorganisms and plants clean the water, so it's cleaner at the end of the watershed. But also provide pollination. So those are sort of what we call provisioning ecosystem services. Those are the easiest to understand. Then there are the regulating ecosystem services. These are, for example, controls flooding. Imagine a watershed that has no vegetation. When it rains, it's going to have a lot of erosion, and all the water is going to flow directly to whatever outlet it has. And so an intact ecosystem that has vegetation, trees, is going to moderate that flooding. So that's an ecosystem services that is providing for whoever lives in the bottom of the watershed, correct? And so that's control of flooding. We talk about purifying water. Stores carbon. We all know about the relation between the carbon cycle and climate change. Most of the carbon is in the biosphere. So whatever the ecosystems do in holding carbon are providing an enormous service in ameliorating the impact of climate change, correct? So they clean the air. And then there's another, so those are the easiest ecosystem services to understand. The provisioning, the regulating, and those are examples, but you can think about very many more. And then there are other ecosystem services. They're called the cultural ecosystem services that also change a lot from region to region. And for example, for me, the one that is most interesting that I connect is recreation. I enjoy hiking, that's an ecosystem service that an intact ecosystem provides me. But that changes from person to person, from group to group. Others are aesthetic. People are pleased by certain landscapes. And there are sort of religious sites, there are sacred sites. So those are the cultural ecosystem services. And the 4th group is the supporting ecosystem services. These are ecosystem services that are supporting the other 3, like soil formation, photosynthesis, and biodiversity, and habitat. Those are ecosystem services that we do not consume them directly, but they help us. We consume the provisioning ecosystem services like food and clean water and fish. And so the only thing I'm asking from this slide is that you remember these 4 names, because we're going to be using them a lot. The provisioning, the regulating, the cultural, the supporting. If you have, so we're going to be building on these 4 types of ecosystem services. Then, and also you can imagine these ecosystem services when we wrote a part for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. There was a lot of debate where you put each one, but each time you do a classification, there are many classifications, but this is one of them. And I particularly fought for having biodiversity not as a supporting ecosystem service, but I lost. So there it is. And accept when I lose. So now I'm reporting that biodiversity is a supporting ecosystem service. That it is, but it's also something that you can utilize directly. And so the point that I want to, this idea of ecosystem services became very popular. And I think we wrote this book like 20 years ago. And I think I have a chapter on grasslands there. And then there are books, there's the ecosystem. There's a lot of interest in this. And I think the last time, these are the number of papers published on ecosystem services, that they have ecosystem services in the title. In these, you see that the integral, this is a cumulative number. We are around 1,200 or 1,300 papers published on this idea of ecosystem services. And this is, so what I would like to convince you is, so first of all, so this is the supply of ecosystem services. And the next step that was interesting is how those ecosystem services are affecting the humans. That this is and remember that this is a anthropocentric view of the ecosystems. So what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did was link, do you remember these 4 types of ecosystem services? The provisioning, the regulating. They link to what are called the constituents of human well-being. So you, and then we have things that are very easy to understand. One of the constituents of well-being is basic material for a good life, like adequate livelihood, sufficient nutritious food. Those are the things that we humans care. We want to have enough food, and the food of good quality. And you understand then how this aspect of well-being is related to an ecosystem service that is food provisioning. And that food provisioning depends on photosynthesis and nutrient cycling. So this is what this big effort of ecosystem services has been, to link the functioning of ecosystems to humans, map them in a more direct fashion. Instead, in the past, we sort of have this broad view that what ecosystems and nature do is good for us. But I think what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did was trying to map those relationships in a much more direct fashion, correct? And so this is for basic material for a good life. We talk about adequate livelihood, sufficient nutritious food, shelter. But then you start getting other things that are more complicated, and you see that there's not a direct relationship. So the provision in ecosystem services affect that, but also affect security, for example, because there's a lot of conflict when there's not enough food or water, or and also affects health, because there's a relationship between food availability and health. And there's a weaker relation between provisioning and good social relations, like social cohesion and mutual respect. So you see how this was were related. So we have 4 ecosystem services, 4 basic constituents of human well-being. And the rest of the talk will be to try to convince you of this shift in emphasis from the supply of ecosystem services to reconciling supply and demand. So my idea is that most of those 1,300 papers were about describing what ecosystems do to humans. And you see that the arrows go always from ecosystems processes to ecosystem services to human well-being. They always go into this direction. And the 1,300 papers documented, and the books and the journals, all of them documented in that direction. What are the different parts of the world, this piece of land, what are the ecosystem services that provide? And they provide clean water. And then another paper says provides carbon sequestration. Another one shows that it provides pollination. So that's what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And this is what in this environment, I'm going to call the supply of ecosystem services. But I think that the under-recognized element is what I call the demand for ecosystem services. And I'm going to be arguing that the supply of ecosystem services doesn't matter if there's not a real demand. We can have a wonderful watershed that provides a lot of clean water, but there's nobody there to drink the water. That water has no value for humans. So there's a middle section between the two that is what I call the use of ecosystem services. So we do not use all the ecosystem, maybe a lot of clean water in Alaska, but nobody's there to drink it. And there are a lot of demands of ecosystem services that are not being met. So there's some sort of overlap between the two. And the whole class is about saying that in the past, we focused on the supply, and now we need to reconcile the two, the demand and the supply. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about how we quantify demand for ecosystem services. And we want to talk which kind of ecosystem services are more demanded by different groups of people. How does demand change among stakeholders and regions? So you see now that we are adding one more layer of complexity, because we said that this particular ecosystem provide this ecosystem service, carbon fixation. But now we have a demand, but the demand varies among stakeholders. So you care about carbon sequestration because you care about climate change. But you don't care about climate change. You care about conservation. And you care about clean water. So each of them, so now we're multiplying. Not only we have a series of ecosystem services, we have a series of ecosystem services by stakeholders. Not all the stakeholders care for the same things. All of them have different value systems. Correct? This is a very important thing. And then I'm going to be talking about which are the main drivers of that ecosystem service demand by the different stakeholders. Correct? Yes? And briefly I'm going to talk about to give you an idea how people estimate the demand for ecosystem services. And this is where we got right in the middle between the biological sciences and the social sciences. The simplest way is to do these people preferences by collation of responses of questionnaires. And so you ask people what they expect from the ecosystem services. And there are basically two ways to do that. One is the social surveys. You ask people to what are the ecosystem services that they value the most. And that is what brings up what the social scientists call the more visible ecosystem services. So those are more prominent. And then, like, for example, recreation, aesthetic value, natural hazard regulation like flood regulation and things like that. Then the other possibility is to do a ranking exercise. It's a list of services, and that brings the least obvious for them. It's like if you have a child, instead of saying what you want, you give him what do you want. These are your 3 options for gifts for Christmas. So you have to pick one of 3, and then the least obvious start coming up. So these are different social techniques from the social sciences to estimate how the demand for ecosystem services changes. And finally, they're trying to identify what are the drivers of this ecosystem service demand. What is trying to, therefore, to predict the demand of ecosystem services. And here, if you remember the 3 balls, the supply was the green, the demand was the red, and then what we've done here is to do that. Try to split that by type of ecosystem service. And here I warn you, when you try to understand that, this is a very scale-dependent diagram. And this is thought of at the global scale. But it's certainly in your backyard, it's going to look different. And this is going to be part of the game we're going to play at the end, is trying to downscale that to the area that you know the best. So in the case of provisioning, the demand, if we think about food production, for example, the demand is much larger than the total supply. Why? There are there's hunger in this world. There are people that there's not enough food to feed everybody. But at the same time, there are parts of that we don't use all our supply. And that's because of distribution issues, but there's excess food in some areas, even though the total demand is larger than the... In the case of the supporting ecosystem services, what we have is they do not overlap. We don't eat photosynthesis. We don't use... So those are two separate worlds. But we still think that there is more supply than demand. And then in terms of the regulating, for example, if we think about carbon sequestration, there's an infinite need for... We can always sequester as much carbon as it's... All the carbon that is being sequestered is good to reduce climate change. So we use all the... And finally, the cultural and recreation, and we argue here for a long time, but I think the idea is at the global level, the supply is still much larger than the demand. If you think about recreation, there are a lot of areas that are least explored, but also depends from ecosystem service to ecosystem service. So the next thing is to put that in a form of a table and see if we can grab these concepts. So these are different stakeholders. You remember that and then you have, for example, here you have one stakeholder is the farmer. So the farmer in a grassland area, for example, cares about forage supply for livestock production. That's what he or she wants. And cares a little bit about the regulating services that sustain forage production. And I want to highlight this, for example, the recreational hunter cares about the supply of game species. They want to go hunting, they want to have animals to hunt, but they care about the recreation and aesthetic enjoyment. Then you have another stakeholder is who is interested in conservation, and they care about habitat for endangered and rare wildlife species and regulating services to sustain habitat quality. And you can go on and on and on, but look at, for example, the difference between the conservationist and the passive nature tourist. This one just cares about the recreation and aesthetic enjoyment. This one cares about habitat. So what I want to highlight here is that we are all different. There is not, and I'm trying to undermine this idea that there is one way to manage the ecosystems. There is not, and I think that is a mistake that we scientists do. We say this is the way things should be. There is not. There are as many, there are many pathways as there are stakeholders. And we are stakeholders a way of lumping. I mean, we cannot just, but all of us have different values, and therefore there are the different options. So this is the same figure than the one before, but in a graphical form. So I have here the farmer, the service provider, the recreational hunter, the passive tourist, the active tourist. And in the axis we have the four groups of ecosystem services, the production services, the supporting services, and you see, so the graphic that I want you to take home is how each of them want different things. Therefore, that is hopefully drives the message that there is not a single solution, but what maximize this axis certainly does not maximize this axis. So different options for different people. And the corollary of that is that our job as scientists is not to tell people what to do, but to clarify the trade-offs, because it's not clear whose values are more important. And then now we want to make a change to what are the drivers of ecosystem service demand. Because I keep telling you, and you sort of believe that there's differences among individuals in their demand for ecosystem services. But social scientists went a little bit further and tried to understand what are the major drivers of this ecosystem service demand, not the supply. And these are and think about them each one. Monthly income. The wealthiest people they become more interested in cultural services and less interested in productive services or provisioning services. Correct? Imagine that. And there are differences about the level of education. in people who live in an urban setting versus a rural setting, or the geographic location. Different parts of the world value different things. Environmental awareness, cultural values, age, gender, available technologies to replace ecosystem services. So this is what?
Everything.
Those are the things that make ourselves, how different groups of people affect their demand for ecosystem services. And also the demand for ecosystem services and the supply has changed through time. So the idea is that pre-settlement was the supply when humans were a very small population and they accounted for a small part of the functioning of the planet. The supply was much larger than the demand, and the humans met all the demand. And now we are in a point where, depending on what kind of ecosystem service we supply and demand are sort of about the same. And we all, I think, share in this room the idea that this is our future, that we are we're moving into a world of 9 billion people where not only we're going to have more people, but all of them are going to want to eat more, going to eat more meat, they want to have more ecosystem services, while the supply, you see the green bubble, if anything, we've seen throughout these 2 years there's degradation and there's a decrease in the supply of ecosystem services. So this is the way we see the trend into the future. And so I couldn't resist to put this figure because I think it's a gem. This is a paper by Dave Tillman in PNAS a few years ago. And what I think it's saying here is how the demand for ecosystem services is changing. So what he has here is per capita GDP in US dollars per year. And this is the per capita caloric demand in kilocalories per day. And these are different A, B, C, D, E, F, G are different groups of countries, clusters of countries. And what is amazing is that all fit in this beautiful line. So what is this saying to you? What does it say? What?
Say the human behavior.
Yeah.
Changing.
But what does it say to you, this curve? What is the message that tells? What is? What? With what? What?
When you have more money,
More money, more? Yeah, but also what is stunning to me is that no matter if you are Chinese, a European, an American, the more money you have, the more you want to eat. Or at least, I think, I don't remember exactly the different colors, but I think the reds is the US, and you can imagine the usual suspects, and that's probably is Europe. And these are, for each one of this is the temporal trend from, I think this is for US and Europe, go from 61 to 2003, as all became, so this is sort of a very clear example of how our demand changes. So it seems to be pretty rigid. And so this is the most developed countries that make the most money. But you see the poorest countries, as soon as they get more money, they just get right on the same curve. So I thought that was a very interesting quantification of human behavior at a global scale. And so we can talk whatever we want, but that seems to be what humans do. The more money they get, the more they want to eat. At some point, they're going to be all very fat, and they're going to, but we haven't gotten there yet. And then, so I don't know. This is a very concrete way of yes.
It's interesting that in poorer countries, the slope is much higher.
Yeah, they are trying to catch up. I don't know, but I think I discussed this figure with somebody, and then they were Googling the paper, and they were able to, I don't know, I could do better to just pick up what is the different colors of dots are different groups of countries. But I think I didn't want to make it too long of a digression here, but just to show you that there are ways of quantifying demand, and the demand seems to be the changes in demand with the different drivers. And you remember that one of the first drivers here was monthly income, and see how income affects, in this case, one of the provisioning services, that food production, correct?
But here we can see the quality of
Pardon me?
the quality of caloric demand.
No, I don't know. This, maybe we can look at you can Google the
In a way, you can guess that poor people in rich countries are eat really bad.
Yeah, you probably.
Because they're still in
Yeah, we can delve into this thing. Yeah, and but yeah, we can spend a week or a month discussing preferences in though this is our hypothesis about how the demand for types of ecosystem services changes as a function of these three major drivers. And we think that all of them go in parallel, with increases in monthly income, with place of residence, and with the level of education. And the three of them are changing through time. As we become more wealthy as a planet, we increase our income per capita. Most of the world is becoming urban now. We passed the 50% threshold. There's more people in the world living in cities than they are living in the rural world. And that trend seems to be only increasing. And we are all increasing our level of education. So our hypothesis, and this is not supported by a lot of data, is that this is a 0 to 100 of all the ecosystem services that exist in this time. I think we hypothesize that the cultural and supporting ecosystem services and the regulated ecosystem services are going to increase in demand through time as we become more wealthy, more urban, and we're going to decrease the relative importance of provisioning of ecosystem services. So the thinking is that somebody who lives in a very, very poor region and his or her major ecosystem services, food, water, and wood to firewood. You can imagine that. Somebody who just has to, their subsistence level. As they become more wealthier, there are other things that they want. They want clear water. And they become wealthier and more urban. They want recreation. And that also changes from cultural, from group to group. And,
Sorry.
yes?
That the provisioning service, the demand for provisioning service will decrease also in absolute values if we increase the monthly income?
No, probably in absolute values it's going to continue increasing. Since population is increasing to at least to 9 billion people, and we show you that we're all becoming wealthier, so probably we're going to eat more in the year 2050 than we are eating now. And we're going to produce more food, but so this is sort of it's relative. So, and this is a hypothesis. But you can like it or hate it or ignore it. And so now I'm going to do a little digression, but I promise I'm going to come back. And I'm going to show you some data on, I have to focus on a region because the world is too big. So I'm going to focus on the demand for ecosystem services in United States drylands. So if you have a map, imagine US. The western US tend to be dry, tend to be mostly public land. And so I gather some data, and what I'm going to ask is at the end of this chat, is that you try to do this same mental exercise for the part of the world that you know the best. And so we collected some data for things like number of visitors in the Bureau of Land Management land. So most of the land in the western United States is owned by the state. This is a public land. And it's administered by several organizations. One of them is the Bureau of Land Management that manages the land. So, and one of the important thing is that doesn't mean that it's not a national park. It's public land, but it's grazed by people that bring their cattle and they are charged. So, but it's administered by the Bureau of Land Management. And all the data are public. So we were able to get the number of visitors in this Bureau of Land Management. Each time you go, there's a click and they count it. And, and you see that there's a trend from 1996. There's an increase in the demand for this ecosystem service, assuming it's recreation. And then we have data for wildlife viewers increasing, number of hunters, and here is another source, is number of visitors, millions per year to national parks. So with the land in the western United States, you have land that is administered by the Bureau of Land Management. Some of it is national parks, some of it is Forest Service, different organizations, but they have different missions. And imagine that in each of your contexts, there are similar organizations that manage different parts of the public lands and have different objectives. So what I'm trying to show you here is that apparently, in my eyes, there's an increase in the demand for these cultural services, that at least for the arid lands. And this is what is sort of striking. So this needs a little bit of a, so the Bureau of Land Management manages huge amount of land. For each section of the land, they have a carrying capacity. So they say, here we can have so many, and they measure that in something called animal unit month. How many, you can have 30, in this section you can have 30 cows per month. So if you're going to keep them all, you can have them 30 cows for a month, or you can have 3 cows every month for. So this is the unit they use. And so then they rent the land to ranchers that want to bring their cows to graze on the land. And that's what they call the billing. They build those, and they usually, it's pretty conservative and they charge not much. And so this is the first. So you see the animal unit month billed. So that's the number of people who brought their cows to these public lands. And it's steady decrease since the 1945 to 2015. So, and another interesting graph is in all the BLM. So the blue lines are the carrying capacity, the permitted, how much, and the green one is the build. So they are not able to, they have an offer of forage. They're not people that they're not interested in that. They don't want to bring their cows. There's an excess supply compared to the demand. And this is for a particular region. It's called in Las Cruces, close to my research site. And you see the same gap. Never the number of permits sold to the people to bring their cows never met the offer. And what is interesting is, complement the picture is this is hay exports from the U.S. The U.S. is selling hay. You may imagine it's kind of a mind-blowing that so there's more forage, more hay that they can use, so they are exporting. Doesn't seem to be a thing that you can imagine putting in a big ship and sending it to Saudi Arabia, but that's what they do. So these are ways of, so what do you get out of this picture of what people, how are the demands for ecosystem services in the Western U.S., how are they changing? What if people, tell me.
Well, basically they're shifting to cultivation, from farming to cultivation.
You cannot cultivate in the Western United States, it's too dry.
Wow.
They are shifting from, there's an increase in the demand for these other ecosystem services. There are more people that want to go hiking and fishing, and that's what they are demanding from the public lands. That's what is increasing. And the ranching is becoming less important. The food production, and I don't want to get into where the U.S. is producing the meat, but we can imagine. But the only point I want to show you is the shifts in the demand, how humans are changing. And so we cannot just think about ecosystem services as something that just from the supply point of view, this is what so many cows we can have, because what now we're telling you is that there are fewer and fewer people interested to bring their cows to graze in this public land.
Because they prefer to feed them indoors?
What? That's what I don't want to go. I don't want to go to an analysis of most likely they go into feedlots but the ecosystem service forage production, and the Western United States is huge. It's kind of like Europe. I mean, it's a big chunk of the world. Yes.
But if you exclude California, it's the same as that.
What?
If you exclude California.
This is the Western. This is not doesn't include California. We can go more detail. Yeah, California doesn't have much in terms of rangelands.
Yeah, but ecosystem services there.
The Central Valley of California is a big food production area, but it's mostly agriculture. Have almonds and more intensive agriculture. All the fruits and the U.S. are producing California. What?
Wine.
Wine, very important. Yeah. So.
And also urbanization can affect on consider as a driving force.
Yes, that's my, so the only two things that I wanted to show you is this shift in ecosystem services demand. So this is not fixed. Humans change what they want out of the land. And as a parenthesis, I think I'm always puzzled why farmers have such an important political lever. I mean, they have a lot. I mean, you see that it looks like the ranchers are, they're not very important. That the conservationists and the hikers should have a much more. But however, the farmers are the most. Still have a lot of political will, and we think that has to do with what you just asked. It is changes in urbanization for this area in the 10 arid U.S. states, so these are the western United States, you see the total population since 1980 till the present is rapidly increasing. So this is a shift in the United States, so we call it a shift from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. From the Sun Belt is the southern states, they are warmer, and there's a migration from we call the Rust Belt, so mostly the old industrial states from the northeastern since all the manufacturing went abroad, most people is migrating southwest. So you see this, but this is the total increasing population. Look at what happened with the rural population, stay very flat. And most of it is metro population. And these are sort of the red ones are the non-metro urban, so in the suburbs of the cities. What? Metropolitan population. This is urban city. Yeah. What? This is not underground, not in the metro, but what?
Not yet.
Not yet. No. This is metropolitan. This is urban people. This is total people. This is rural people, and these are non-urban, non-metro. So this is another little digression, but I promise that it has a good corollary, and we'll come back together. So. This is about demand for ecosystem services in other areas of the world. And this is a paper coming from Spain, and we have, let me show you, this is it's an assessment, a direct assessment of the demand for ecosystem services in different regions of the world. And I want to point out the different colors are the provisioning, the reds are the regulating, and we have developed regions, developing regions, and here we have rural and urban. So you see that how people in agricultural area have a much higher demand for provisioning services than the same people in the developed world in urban areas. As they become urban, they lose sense, and they have more demand for these other ecosystem services. So this is providing some data in support of this general hypothesis or whatever. Maybe we made the hypothesis based on the data. And also there are differences among the perceptions of people about the importance of ecosystem services and for different ecosystem type from rivers and streams, drylands, and think about drylands seems to be among the least favorite, the ones that are perceived as the least important. So for all of us working in a desertification problems, they have to keep in mind that the large majority of people in your community don't recognize drylands as very important in terms of provisioning ecosystem services. However, the coastal forest, wetlands seem to be much more prominent. And then I'm here going to talk about the effect of woody plant encroachment on livestock production in a comparison of North and South America. And this also has a corollary with the demand for ecosystem services. So who are familiar with the idea of woody plant encroachment? Do you know what that is? Yes? No? No? No. So 40% of the surface of the planet is dominated by some sort of a grassland savanna. And worldwide, there is all these ecosystems being invaded by woody plants, shrub, trees. And we can go into the why, but this is a fact. One of the best estimates, for example, for the US, the area of grasslands covered by woody vegetation, trees or shrubs, increase at the rate of 2.5% per year. 2.5% per year is enormous. So every year, 2.5% is growing. There's more in the knee-jerk reaction of the government has been to spray and burning, trying to reduce with very limited success. And so my question driving this particular research was, what are really the consequences of this phenomenon that is happening without trying to understand why it's happening? What are the consequences for ecosystem services? Is really a degradation phenomenon, or is just shifting into a different state, and it's a change in the portfolio of ecosystem services? So the grassland provided these ecosystem services, the woody plant encroach SEM system provides different ecosystem services. And what I found is that there's no quantification, nobody knows, and therefore there's no clear justification for spraying, burning, or it's just because it's changing. So the most obvious ecosystem services was to look at is the effect of food production. So the idea is, and then we decided to look at how woody plant encroachment affects cattle production. And the basic hypothesis, this is a very, very simple linear model, says that livestock production and cattle production, sheep, it's a function of the productivity, net primary production. The more production, the more forage production, the more productive, more livestock production, correct? A humid grassland should have more cows per unit area than a dry grassland. And tree cover, and we expect this beta 2 to be negative. The more tree cover, since under this basic understanding is that what is driving the government response is that the cattle eat grass, they don't eat trees, and therefore if you replace part of the productivity from grasses to trees, therefore that should reduce that. But we don't know what is the function of that. And then, very important, there's an error term, so we're going to get a lot of miles at that error term. We're going to then explore. So this is our basic model. And so we picked two regions of the world that are particularly fun to work on. So this is the United States, this is and this is Argentina. And what happens that is this really great place to work is that they have exactly the mirror climate one from the other. Look, this is precipitation. You see it's the same amount of precipitation, the same gradient from east to west in the US, the same one in Argentina, about the same size. So and here you have the same temperature gradient. This is the US, this is Argentina. These are same vegetation types. We've And so the biophysical context is almost identical in two parts of the world where the socioeconomic environment is quite different. The US is a developed country, Argentina is a developing country. So that was what we were set up to do. So how did we do this? We took a lot of effort. We got census data. So we have, from both the US and Argentina, we have census data at the county level. So we are able to know how many heads of cattle, how many sheep, how many everything, heifers, for each county in the US and in Argentina. All the gray areas are areas that were, for example, all these gray areas is because it's agriculture. This is cultivated, so there is no rangeland. So this is if you remember our equation here, this is the dependent variable, the livestock production. Now is this measured in, we had a range of variables, but we picked one that, all of them were very much correlated. We picked reproductive cows per square kilometers to give you, and also you see they have more or less the same density. And this is net plant production that we calculated from MODIS. There's satellite information. And here we have tree cover that is another product of MODIS. And what we found is this interesting response surface. And first of all, is what we did find is that increasing production here from 500 to 700 increases livestock production. And increasing tree cover decreases, like you would expect it, but now we can quantify that. In Argentina, we have the overall same pattern, but also at very low productivity and low precipitation, we see that of the opposite effect, there is that tree cover increases production. And then we speculate that has to do with shade. These are sort of a very marginal grazing land where non-forage factors may play, but we don't know. Whoop. And but perhaps what I think is the gem of this article, and that's how I'm going to go back to the demand for ecosystem service, are these two values here. In the US, the same model explains 24% of the variability. In Argentina, it explains 50% of the variability. And so, and this is the same. So in the US, the same model, this is the same model explains 24%. In Argentina, explains 50% of the variability. And so here, our explanation it goes back to demand for ecosystem services. In a developing country, the major ecosystem services, the ranchers manage their land to maximize provision in ecosystem services, maximize food production. In the US, the demand is more, there's a variety of demands. So a lot of people try to have high productivity of cattle production, but all other people own land for other reasons, because just they want to have a ranch. They don't want to have cows, but just they want to have, they like the lifestyle. Or there's a lot of public land that is using for other things, for conservation or recreation or carbon sequestration or other reasons. Therefore, that's why we find that in the US, the effect of primary production in woody plant encroachment is less important. So here are, to give you two, this is the number of cattle in the two countries. So Argentina is the orange one. You see there are ups and downs, but it's slightly declined. But the US cattle and rangelands is declining rapidly. And if you look at the agricultural population, you see that also is declining in both countries. But in the US, it's almost disappearing, the agriculture population. So most people, that matches what I told you before. And so that leads me to this final slide. This is my overall conclusion of what determines land use. What we do with a piece of land. What in a very simple way, it depends on the supply of ecosystem services. Ecosystem service, the sum of all the ecosystem services that piece of land can produce. Imagine a piece of land, that's what and we sum them all the ecosystem services. But also, it's a matter of the demand for that ecosystem service J by stakeholder I. Because now we have different stakeholders that care different things. And you have to weight the stakeholder by their political power. Because it's not that each of us have the same power. If there are some groups that have more political power, and therefore what we do with land is a function of what is that land can provide, and what is different groups want. And what is not not all the groups have the same weight. This is not a democracy. They have different people that have different weight. And I chose to make that, call that political power, but you could call social value of the social capital of the different stakeholder groups. There's some stakeholder groups that are better organized. So I think this is what I wanted to sort of synthesize the whole talk today, was to show that we started by focusing on the supply of ecosystem services, and now we shifted the demand of ecosystem services, that we need both. We need to understand both. And the demand, we have to split it by stakeholders, and also the weight of the different stakeholders. And each one of those in your home place, you're going to recognize the different stakeholders and how some of them, I already hinted that I didn't understand why the farmers have such enormous political power, but they are. I mean, in the US, there's the Farm Bill, is very important. The farming in the US accounts for 2% of the GDP. Nothing. So why do we care? But what? Votes. But there are not very many farmers. Where are they? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the farmers vote, and they are, and they vote. They tend to be very Republican, very. What? Yeah, because but that's the U.S. politics. So there's a division between rural, urban. The urban parts of the U.S. tend to be more progressive, more Democrat, and that's it. So I